line. Um, so definitely, I feel like that the term disability often brings to mind the visible disabilities, and invisible disabilities are often not thought about. And this would include various forms of depression, ADHD, and dyslexia, and of course, autism and anxiety. Wanda, you've been so open and openly speaking about you being an autism mom and having autism. Can you tell me a little bit about your personal experiences, even pre and now post COVID-19? Sorry, you just have to unmute yourself there. Thank you.
Thank you for acknowledging visible and invisible disabilities, because actually invisible disabilities are the majority. We make up about 80% of those with varying abilities. That's not necessarily well known though. So it is because of my experiences that I decided to speak openly about my own journey and receiving a diagnosis as a woman with autism at middle age and being an autism mom. It's because I had the experiences of people having the same expectations of me as they have of other people, because from the outside looking in, there's nothing about me that is different. However, my neurology is different from the mainstream. So I interact differently, I communicate differently, and so therefore I flourished when that's understood, and people can interact with me coming from an understanding. In terms of COVID, it has been an epiphany. It did not take long for me to realize that some of the things that disability advocates have been championing for years and have been actually turned down, moved into place overnight, because the world essentially had to work from home. So to give you some key examples, improve technological support, flexibility around hours, other kinds of flexibility built in were a reality overnight in March. And so it was early in the pandemic that I began to reflect and think, we have a real opportunity here. This could be a game changer. And then all COVID did was continue to highlight this opportunity, and that there's no going back. No, the disability community has been left behind, but we're going to say, this is the time. We know what accommodations can be put in place quickly to the benefit of individuals, to the benefit of the workplace, to the benefit of society. Let's do this right across, because we know that once supports are put in place, most of them actually cost very little. Once they're put in place, how much it can mean in terms of increased productivity, increased satisfaction, increased quality of life. So COVID has been a huge learning experience for me, and I am moving forward in the inclusion revolution, and I hope everyone's moving forward with me.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I love inclusion revolution. That's amazing. That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your journey as well. That was really that was great. I guess just to kind of step back a little bit, the term disability has been around for a really long time now, and looking at it from kind of the English, the dictionary perspective, dis is oftentimes, it's viewed as a negative, you know, as part of the vocabulary. So I wanted to ask you, you know, Wanda, Christina, is it time to kind of start stepping away from the word disability? What are your thoughts on that? Wanda, if you want to, yeah.
We can, for the reasons that you just said. It's not something that I have necessarily been putting a lot of my attention and my energy towards. I'm not saying that people shouldn't. Everyone has their own contribution to make. Everyone has their own priorities. I'm open to it, and sometimes you will see me, and perhaps even in communication with you and others here on the panel. I've been putting small d, is, capital A. I've been saying varying abilities, but it's not something that I've held on to and said, I'm adopting this unilaterally. Not because it's not important. It's because I am paying attention and putting more emphasis on other things.
Thanks, Wanda. Christine? Not sure if she's able to. Perfect. Christina, if you want to kickstart this, I'm going to just check in with Christine just to make sure everything's okay. Sorry, would you mind kickstarting, Christina?
Yes, I was just unmuting my mic.
Oh, okay, sure, no problem.
It's a little laggy sometimes. I don't know. My computer plays tricks on me all the time. So I mean, for me, I think that I just prefer, like, this is just what I prefer. Everybody has difference in opinion. For me, I see it as like, I like person first language. I like when people say persons with disabilities. This is something that just I myself like. Everybody is different. When it comes to the language, I always see it as almost the same way you would ask someone their pronouns. I sometimes would like someone to ask me how I would identify with words my abilities. But I mean, there is a history in the language, right? We have to look back in the abilities community's history and realize there's still words being used today that are very discriminatory. The R word, the big one. And I'm sorry if anybody got triggered by me saying that. I just feel that it does need to be brought to people's attention. I would like to see more positive language when it comes to the abilities community. I would love that. It is a beautiful community. And I also do find it interesting that if you don't know the history of the words and the word change, you don't understand a culture sometimes, right? And something that always bothers me is that, you know, it's common knowledge about certain cultures and customs and all that, but the abilities community isn't really mentioned except, like, you know, our history in World War II and eugenics. Like, that is something that is taught in schools, but nothing more. Is how I feel about the word being used. I think that people should be able to identify as a person with a disability the way they would like.
Thanks, Christina. That was an excellent point that you brought on in terms of individuals being told and kind of sharing their thoughts on preference. I think that was a really excellent point that you brought on. Thank you so much. So Christina's trying to figure out how to come back online. Unfortunately, she's trying a variety of different methods. So hopefully she'll be able to join us shortly. I want to kind of shift a little bit as well. Part of being in COVID-19, one of the things that definitely came out of it was concerns over affordability. Persons with disabilities, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, and typically do fall under the low income bracket. And one of the biggest concerns that was raised by the persons with disabilities community was on the difficulties of accessing financial assistance and funding. So one, of course, being the one-time payment of $600. And I believe recently Premier Doug Ford announced that COVID relief will be ending for ODSP and Ontario Works recipients as well. So kind of keeping that in mind, it's really hard to comprehend the why behind these decisions. And I want to kind of get your thoughts, Jeanette, Kirin, and Christine, if you can. What needs to be implemented to, one, provide a better form of accessibility in terms of financial assistance and funds and support for those individuals who actually do need it? Corinne, if you don't mind kickstarting that.
Sure. I think there's like different things also about that. Like, I think that's something that's really important to realize is that, you know, people with disabilities, since there's like 24% of all women in Canada are women with disabilities, that means that there are women with disabilities, and we know that this number is actually low. It's actually higher than that because of the people who can't fill out the census. And so what we know is that women with disabilities are at different levels, right, of socioeconomic class. But also what we know is that a lot of women with disabilities are currently on welfare or, you know, and disability, or in really low paying jobs because of their need for accommodations to perhaps work only part-time. And so what that means is that there's so many kinds of disabilities, right? Like as Wanda was mentioning, right, visible and invisible, that the government right now is only recognizing certain kinds of disability. I'm saying the federal government. And so when they were doing things like the CERB, for example, or the one for students, some people with disabilities actually fit within those, right? Because they lost their job because of COVID, because they were students not being able to find a job. But so many people were not, you know, were falling through the cracks. But at the same time, the federal government does not have a list of people with disabilities across the country. And so they created this advisory group that my executive director actually sits on. And they fought really hard to figure out what's needed, because something that we do know is that a lot of people with disabilities across the country, some of them stepped up in order of like doing mutual aid. Like I'm thinking about the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, for example, in Hamilton, and doing food banks and home delivery and all of that. But also everything started costing more money than it already did. So for people who are on ODSP in Ontario, welfare in Quebec, and other similar provincial programs, saw that the few, you know, the small amounts that we're getting monthly actually covered less and less. And yet, it was pretty hard for a lot of them to access those credits. Personally, I think that something that would be helpful would be that something that's potentially some kind of universal, you know, income that everyone is allowed to get. And right now, it seems that $2,000 a month is what people need to live. And so if that's the amount, then the people who don't need it, you know, we pay it back in tax. People who need it can use it, instead of right now making sure people fit through so many hoops in order to maybe get some of those disability tax credits and then are eligible for $600. So for me, that's one of the things that could be helpful. Obviously, that comes with a lot more, like EBI is a little bit more complex than that, but I think that's something that could actually be helpful for a lot of people with disabilities, especially when we consider the extra costs that disability may actually bring to some people, whether it's meds, whether it's therapy sessions, whether, like, I'm thinking both, you know, psychotherapy, but also physical therapy. I'm thinking about mobility aids, you know, special software, et cetera, which are all extra costs that for some of us, maybe we don't need. And yet for other people, they're essential for their livelihood.
Thank you so much, Corinne. Christine, are you able to join us? Not sure. Okay, Christina, that's okay.
So when I do, so I'm a social service worker and a developmental service worker. I deal with this a lot. I can tell you the disability movement has been heard about the definitions needing to be widened to other programs such as permanent disability pension. I believe you all heard that other disability programs are included, but those on ODSP were not included in the definition, which is a huge problem because a lot of people do assume that if you get ODSP, that you automatically get the disability tax credit. This is false. My average case that it takes me to get the proper documentation for one individual, and I am talking with either minimal or extensive disabilities, is 6 months, and that's if they have complete communication with their medical professionals. This could be specialists, doctors, nutritionists, blood work. Also, every single support letter, if worded incorrectly, will be denied, and the individual will not be told why they were denied. I personally think that anyone on ODSP should be getting the disability tax credit and vice versa. And those waiting for all the documentation should be getting the disability tax credit. For example, because there are so many people on the other social assistance called Ontario Works that are disabled and are in the process of getting all the documentation, it can be overwhelming. You don't need someone to give 100 pages worth of documentation asking them to fill out the cost and maybe be reimbursed. I definitely emphasize maybe. They're not all reimbursed, and you don't get that paid back on your taxes as an expense. So another issue I would say that is I have a really clear example, and I will pull from a lot of amputees that I work with. They're very frustrated because obviously they have a permanent disability. It will never go away. As my friend who's a comedian, Michael Lipschitz, says, he always says that it's like they think my arm, sorry, not his arm, that my leg is going to grow back. And that there's a chance of my leg growing back every 3 years. It should be much easier for it to just say, after you have done the application once, that you are permanently disabled, you will get this for life. You do not have to renew, but you have the option in case you do have more expenses because you develop new disabilities to add it to your file. To me, it's a thing that the general population doesn't understand. They think everybody with a disability or on ODSP have the disability tax credit. 75% of them get denied. And the people reviewing the disability tax credit are not experts. I can tell by the reasoning they give. Another example would be, well, in the documentation, it shows symptoms of leukemia. And yes, we provided you from the doctor the test results that the individual has leukemia. Example of someone getting denied. Or the documentation just simply can't reflect the struggles the person is going through. A really good resource, and it was a video that really touched me was called We Regret to Inform You, about this woman who lost her job. She couldn't go on EI because if she went on EI, she would lose her health benefits. You could see from the video the personal struggles this woman went through every day. And the part that made me so sad is at night, after one of her family members acting as her caregiver put her to bed, it echoed in her head the letter. Benefit, thank goodness. But you also have to remember, they only back your disability 5 years from when you apply. So she is obviously a person who was born this way. She makes that clear in the video. So she's had this disability her entire life, all these disabilities, but yet they're not going to recognize her disability till 5 years ago. So these are issues that when like I said, I get a lot of these calls of why they denied me, of why are they doing this to me? I need this, I need to, not everything is covered. At least if I can put it on the tax credit, I get something. So it is vital. It's a vital service. And there is a huge barriers, especially when it comes to getting the paperwork requested. It can be anything from $100 to $200. Keep in mind, for years, these people might have to, even though they're only going to get 5 years of back pay, once they do obtain it, which the average person, I can say, gets denied about 3 times, the average. I've known people who have gotten denied 9 times, and they've been waiting years. And they have clear documentation stating their disabilities, stating how it affects their lives, blood work showing their backed up information. They need a separate support letter from their health professionals. They all have to be the same. If one is saying or not reflecting the whole person's support system, that is the one that's chosen usually. And it's very unfair and very frustrating that this was brought to the attention of people making these decisions. I know the people in the abilities movement, and that they got some of the information there, but then once again you see the ableism where they were only listening to half of what these people were saying.
Thanks so much, Christina. So many wonderful points that was brought up there. Amazing. I think kind of there are obviously several things that have been exposed since COVID and financial accessibility. One of them, the pandemic has also exposed other significant areas of inequality and exclusion. Looking at mainly the digital world. For persons with disabilities. And in normal circumstances, essential services is already challenging to access. And since COVID-19, the need for digital accessibility has certainly amplified. And not everyone has the ability to access web services as well, right? So I want to kind of ask you, what necessary steps should businesses and governments need to begin taking in order to ensure, especially web support services and essential services can be more accessible? So I wanted to, I know that Christine is not able to join us. She's facing tech difficulties here, but I wanted to ask you, Christina and Corinne, to kind of kickstart this as well. So either Christina or Corinne, if either of you want to take this on. Or Corinne, let's start.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to look at Christina's face to see.
All right.
And so there's, yeah. So the thing that's really important to remember is that it's not because it's online that it's accessible. It's not because it's online that everyone has access to tablet. I'm thinking especially about people in rural areas or, you know, northern places where they don't have high-speed internet. And so, you know, events such as this, which are great for someone like me with city-based, with fast internet, is actually not actually possible for them. The thing that's also important to realize is that a lot of people, even before that, you know, were trying to get access remotely, especially I'm thinking about people from the deaf communities, because that was the only way you could get service, you know, from governmental agencies, because they would have, they could do the service relay phone, the phone relay service. And so they've been using that. However, a lot of the services right now are not thinking about people with disabilities because they're like, we just need to roll out something, right? And that's part of the roller coaster and the resilience that we've talked about, is that when we had to close, we closed everything and then we rolled out things. And then right now we're also, a lot of people are noticing that things are not perfect. One way of making sure is to make sure that there is accessibility audit of websites, phone lines, chatbot, applications. Something that was really surprising to me was when I was looking at project management software, like applications that are on the cloud, so we could work as a team. None of them were accessible to people who are low vision or blind. They were just like, yeah, we can maybe, but not really, unless you code it yourself, which I do not have that capacity. But they was not even in their plans to do it in the next 6 months or something. It was like, oh yeah, thanks for letting us know. It's in our like list of things to do, you know, like offer this application in 5 different colors, or offer it to people who use JAWS, which is a screen reading software. So those are the things that I think people need to be aware, and to make sure that when you do this accessibility audit, is that you have people with varying disabilities to use it, because something that might work for me might not work for other people. And that's something that's really important to know, that sometimes disability accommodations might actually kind of not, they might contradict each other, right? Someone who's low vision might need really bright light, where someone who's migraine prone and has other medical issues and disabilities actually needs to not have any neons being used. So you need to be able to offer different, for example, brightness of your screens, of your websites, that kind of thing, right? Offer something that's black lit, something that's white lit, so different people will be able to actually access information. And the other thing I would add is to see how, and I'm saying that as like, you know, in the particle, but is digital accessibility or digital access a human rights, right? Is it something that's a basic need? And the reason why I think it's a little funny is because a lot of us consider water, like clean water, to be an essential service that we have access to. We open our taps and there's water, right? And water we can drink, water we can wash ourselves in, water we can boil to cook food. But that's not the case for a lot of Indigenous communities across the country. Their water is not clean, like not clean to drink, not clean to boil, not even clean to wash people or clothes. So I would like to see digital access as something that's an essential service, like water, like housing, like heat. But I also know that that means that only a handful of us will actually get that digital access and others won't. But I think that's something that's really important, especially when I think about schools. And a lot of them, I'm in Quebec, but also Ontario, people can opt for online or in person, and it's a little, the in-person situation seems a little unclear, a little, I would say, scary in terms of risk. But what do you do, right? A lot of people don't have internet at home. A lot of people don't have tablets, computers. They might have a cell phone, but how can you do your homework on your cell phone when you don't have internet, right? And a lot of places that had free internet actually closed, right? The McDonald's, the Timmy's, you know, the community libraries, all those places closed. So what does it mean if we rely on people to be able to do those work and not fall behind? And right, in the case was very flagrant in Quebec, where people went to private school, like the next week they had like, you know, full programs on the internet, everything, apps, the works. And people in public school, it took almost 2 months before something happened. And even then, some teachers had to find old computers refurbish them and send them to kids in neighborhoods. And so who's falling behind? The kids were already behind. The kids who come from immigrant families, families who may not speak English or French, families who may be struggling, mostly, kids of color, and especially for kids with disabilities. Something that was really clear is that if you rely on support at school, any kind of support, you're not getting it at home. So, who cares about you? We'll send you the homework knowing that usually you do your work in school with support, and hope that your parents will be able to do that work with you. So we need to be careful when we think about the internet as the solution for everything.
Thank you so much for bringing up that point, Corinne. One important specific point is that there's no one fits all solution. There shouldn't be, first of all, and to assess situations and provide the appropriate supports and visible needs based on what is needed. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Christina.
Sorry, it does like to lag. So for me, this is where it gets personal for me. I'm a person who heavily depends on digital access to have accommodations. I have 15 disabilities. Guys, it's the worst collector's card game ever. I don't think I'm winning. It's a joke and it's okay for you to laugh, I promise. I won't get mad. A lot of people don't see that I would be someone who needs that kind of assistance. A lot of people, I'm somebody has invisible disabilities with mobility issues. And the issue I always face is the amount of hardship it is when my tech doesn't work, and the costs. And that is a big issue. For example, if let's say my accessibility is attached to my cell phone. If my cell phone gets hacked, I lose the licensing for my adaptive software and I have to repay the original price. That usually takes 4 hours on the phone. Then I have to get support in order to deal with the computer company I deal with. And many times, and I'm tying this in because to see where you guys, so you guys can see the flow of where this is a big issue. People in the first place, they can't even afford internet right now. And that, Corinne, I love that you brought that up. They either can't afford the internet, they don't have those internet resources anymore, or they don't have the software or technology that is needed to even be able to function in daily life. I mean, it ties into the barriers of employment. There has been so many times where I go to an interview, I make them aware of my accommodations, and then I ask, would you be so kind as to let me bring my adaptive software into your office? That's usually when I don't get the calls back because they say we can't do that. The only way we can do that is if you pay for the licensing and tech yourself to be used at the office, and then we own it. That is the biggest barrier I've ever heard. So basically, I have to pay for myself to be accommodated in a workplace if I want the job. And also what some might not know, because I do have a lot of software that I use that I pay for monthly out of my own pocket, don't get reimbursed whatsoever, is that when they say that I have to pay for the laptop, the adaptive mouse, the software I need to be able to give them my best performance, the cost on average is $500 a month for me. But now you need to add in, they want me to do the same thing. They're not even going to provide the laptop. And if they decide they don't like my performance, that they own those licenses. Do you see where the problem is there? That they own the licenses that I paid for so that I can work there. And a lot of people with disabilities are so struggling and so afraid of asking for accommodations that they will go on facing hardships without accommodations. And a lot of the time after they ask for the accommodations, all of a sudden the workplace becomes toxic and they are basically forced to leave. So I see where digital accessibility is definitely around money. I'm bringing up those issues because I face them quite often and I'm not the only one. There are many people I know who do not speak up or disclose to employers because they've had this happen to them in the past so often. Another issue is that obviously those responsibilities should be with the employer and they should not be taking advantage of those people. And they are rarely held accountable. When it comes to digital accessibility though, there is another side to this coin. There are just people who don't know how to do it. And they do want to learn. I myself, someone who loves accessibility, would love to make my charity's website completely accessible, but I don't know how to put the code in to make JAWS work. Or I don't have the resources to a professional that I could get this set up. And that's another issue. So we also have to realize some people just don't know. They want it. I know tons of small business owners who are trying, they just don't know. So I hope that if they make it mainstream, that it is completely mandatory, which I want them to, but that they also give people the resources to make that happen, especially when it comes to small business owners who are very much, in my experience, coal allies.
Thank you so much, Christina. So many amazing points you brought up to address and also as action items. So thank you so much for bringing those up. Corinne, you brought this up earlier about measuring impact of COVID-19. That's an excellent point that you brought up, and I really wanted to kind of address this here. Stats Canada just released their survey to collect information from individuals about how they've been impacted during COVID-19, but it's specific to discrimination. And no is a no-brainer. This information needs to be collected to have a deep examination of the inequities across Canada. And Corinne, one of the items that you'd mentioned was, marginalized communities, and also individuals who cannot afford not only access to internet, but cannot even afford essential services during COVID-19, right? So which also should be an essential service, as you mentioned. So I want to kind of ask you, Jeanette, Kirin, and Christina, are you aware of any data that's currently being collected, aside from like the one that I just mentioned, that's specific to accessibility and persons with disabilities and unemployment and so on during COVID-19 in Canada? Jeanette, if you would mind kind of kickstarting that.
Yeah, it looks like my my microphone has a bit of a lag on it too. You just brought up a really interesting point that sort of links back to the previous question around technology and accessibility, and not just accessibility, but access to technology and all of the different ways that the infrastructure across the country needs to be developed, the capabilities of broadband, all of these things, and then to address the affordability and start making this something that's just available. So when we talk about StatsCan releasing this recent survey, which looks like it's going to be an interesting read when the stats are collected. I actually did the survey a couple of days ago. And I found it a little light. I don't know if anybody else has done the survey, but I found it a little light. So I was like, I wonder what they're going to figure out from something like this. But this whole conversation around accessibility and technology begs the question, how is this survey reaching people who don't have access to technology right now? If the only way to participate is through this online survey, but you can't access internet, or you don't have the technology, or to Corinne's point, it's very hard to do certain things on your phone. If that is, what is considered your home computer, who are we missing? So I think that's a big challenge all the time in data collection is, who are we missing? Who are people who are not being engaged in collecting this information and data? So, you're asking, what's the importance of data collection and the impact of COVID-19 especially? Data collection is extremely important, but we need to learn where the biggest challenges were that we've learned, like the lessons learned so far. What were the biggest challenges? We need to know what were the parts of life that were most impacted and the parts that were least impacted, so that we can look and say, why wasn't this affected? What were the systems that were in place there that allowed that to be a system that you could navigate? When you were talking earlier, Christina and Corinne were talking about the challenges of the social safety net around benefit programs. Anybody who's ever waded into that mess knows that it's almost impossible to navigate in a good day. And the very systems and policies that were put in place are actually, they don't speak to each other. So when we were looking at things like CERB, there was massive confusion, and so Odin has a network of employment service providers across the country, and we've been asking them. We've been trying to collect data, and asking them what are some of the biggest challenges. And early on, one of the big things was to serve or not to serve. Right? People didn't know if you were losing your job, were you supposed to just rely on ODSP when your ODSP was where your earnings were being somewhat supplemented by the incredibly low levels of ODSP. Why would you revert back to these low levels and not qualify for CERB? If you CERB, what would happen to your ODSP? What were the clawbacks? What were the ramifications? So all of these kinds of things that were confusing. So that's a piece I think that we need to look at in data collection moving forward, is how did the systems speak to each other, and how did they work together? We need to also know what are the jobs, what are the sectors that were most impacted and least impacted, and that is being collected, and that information is circulating. But once we have all of that, then we can start to look at what are the problems that we need to address now. What are the things that the data is telling us that we need to pay attention to, so we can plan for a potential second wave, for the challenges that will come if and when. It depends, glass half full, glass half empty. It's coming, or maybe it won't. The other piece that makes data collection so important is that data can influence your workforce development efforts. So it's going to help us to identify where there's an overrepresentation of one part of the population in sectors, or underrepresentation. So we know women are predominantly occupying helping occupations, service industry, caring fields. And these were the areas that were hit hard, very, very, very hard. Anybody who was in the GTA during SARS would remember the impact that had on hospitality and tourism. There were incredible things that grew out of that. The Hospitality Workers Training Center is one of the things. The co-op program, and the housing, and the stability, and the education programs that grew out of that was in direct response. So they learned something from SARS. So we need to learn something from from COVID. And then when we look at the employment service sector, we can start then to work with job seekers to explore areas that maybe weren't as impacted, maybe areas that weren't considered traditional roles. We can start targeting sectors to say there's a disability talent pool that you're not accessing and you need to. And back even to Wanda's point about, you know, the all of a sudden work from home isn't an issue. So, you know, there are opportunities where we can latch onto that as a movement to keep going. But if we don't have the data to tell us what's precarious, what's in danger, what worked, what didn't work, then we're going to miss out on those learning opportunities.
Excellent points. Thanks, Jeanette. Corinne?
So I think that data is very important. The reason why I think data is important is like that's how sometimes we know things, you know, anecdotally, but then once we see it, it actually becomes true, right? It actually makes sense in terms of policies, of programs and services in the future. Because I find that we have very little information about how COVID is affecting. We can guess because, as Jeanette said, right, like we know who works in which sectors, and we know which sectors obviously are more affected by COVID than others, economically, but also health-wise. And so I was very happy, well, happy is a big word, but I was very happy to know that Toronto started collecting race-based and class-based stats around COVID. They didn't start at the beginning, they started in May, but actually that tells us a lot about who's more affected by COVID in ways that we don't know if that's the case. I mean, we could assume that what's happening in Toronto is similar to what's happening outside of Toronto because systemic discrimination is the same, but we don't know. And so that's something I was really interested to read, that something like 21% of all the cases that were reported were affected Black people, even though Black people were only 9% of people living in Toronto. The thing we also have to remember is that they didn't ask anything about disability. We have, I think we don't have the gender aspect as well. But we do have race, and we also have class, social class, right? And so we know that people who are, you know, own less money, live in poorer housing conditions, are the ones that were most affected. Which, you know, I don't think we need a PhD to understand that. I think we would have understood that it's easier to socially distance yourself from other people if you live in a mansion all alone with a garden and a pool and, you know, all the things, than if you live in a cramped apartment with 2 other families because that's all you can afford. That makes sense. And also like how people, especially people with precarious status or no status, which has been the case in Montreal, will do jobs that no one else wants to do. And that means that often those are jobs in the healthcare system as orderlies or attendants, because someone has to do that work and yet no one wants to do it. And those are the people that actually died a lot in Quebec. Those are the people who got sick, those are the people who died. And a lot of those people were really recent newcomers with precarious or a clear status, but we don't know that, right? We know the cases that were flagged, but we don't know is this like overall, because we don't have those stats. And I would say that's the thing about the stats about people with disabilities. When I think about the majority of people who died in the Greater Montreal area, were in the long-term health facility for older people, knowing that a lot of those people have dementia, Alzheimer's, and other issues that makes them unable to live on their own, I would assume that the majority of them were people with disabilities. But again, that was not something there was no survey, studies, census of like, who are those people who died? All we know is like, so-and-so, age 85, you know, this gender died. Maybe we have a photo, maybe there was a thing in a newspaper, a necrology post, so we're able to be like, oh, the family asked us to give money to the Alzheimer's Society. Oh, the family is like this or that. So we can guess that a lot of people that did die were people with disabilities, were older. But we don't have those stats. Right now, something that Disability Women's Network is doing, it's not out yet, but hopefully will be out before the end of the month, if not early September, is to do a survey on specifically to women with disabilities. So I think we've known with working with StatsCan over the years is that often they will have stats about people with disabilities, they will have stats about women, but they rarely have stats about women with disabilities because we become what they call statistically irrelevant. If they only have 3 women with disability would disclose something, they're like, we don't know if it's really true. And this is the same way that a lot of their data that they have, you can ask for desegregation data, but they won't give it to you because they're like, well, the data you ask, let's say I'm like, what about trans women with disability, age 30 to 60, they'll be like, well, we only have 3 people we saw the last census, we fit that criteria. So we won't tell you what they're, if we took those 3, we don't know if it's statistically relevant. And so those are the things that it's really important to know, especially for people who are marginalized, to do our own studies, to do our own work, but also to make sure that we reach out to the people in our own communities who are the most marginalized, right? Because the people who are the most marginalized, people who are the margins of our movement, of our sectors, are the people who actually experience things like pandemics, like COVID, the most, right? When we think about Black Lives Matter, the people who are dying often are people with mental health issues. Those are people with disabilities. We think about what's happening in Canada around Bridges Paquet Kaczynski, or what's happening with that man. Like, so many cases we have in Canada are mental health. They're race and mental health. And yet we don't talk about them because they're too marginalized in both Black or BIPOC communities or within disability communities. They're not at the center. And I think that's something we need to really work at, is to work at who's at the extreme margins of our communities and make sure, right? So I'm thinking about people who are deafblind. I'm thinking about people who are trans. I'm thinking about people who are Indigenous and Inuit and Métis and living up north, right? And we don't need to just care about those of us who are university educated, cisgender, living in urban centers with jobs. We need to care about those of us who don't have those things and don't have those privilege, and make sure, how can we make sure that our movement actually are inclusive, but also are fighting for their rights together.
Thanks so much, Corinne. Christina. Oh. Water break. Okay.
Actually, it's Actually, it was my therapy cat. He would really like to participate in this meeting, so I'm asking my husband to take him into the bedroom. And there's my husband going to get him. There we go. You can't blame him. He's doing his job. His job is to comfort me. So he sometimes chooses to comfort me while I'm doing Zoom calls or presentations. It's great. Well, definitely it echoes a lot of what Corinne says. I mean, since COVID has started, I've participated in so much research, like just, filling out the surveys, telling other people to fill out the surveys, just so that there can be some of that hard statistics out there. But I also get frustrated with stuff like, you see the data, but it's only like little tidbits that you don't have to pay for, right? Like, I know that when I was in university and college, that was put into the tuition, and obviously that research was much more in depth, which was great. But we still have to realize, for those people who have limited resources, and then they do see research on their phone, it even makes it hard to see if it's, one, valid, two, it's a little tidbit on a meme. I've actually gotten some pretty good research from memes, surprisingly, guys. And I do trace them to see if they're legitimate. But not everybody does their due diligence that way, right? But it is frustrating, as well as, like, some people are doing studies, people are giving out their private information, but yet they don't have the right to the results. And I find that incredibly frustrating. In fact, some were like, if you wanted the results, you have to pay for it. And when I heard people telling me that, I'm like, well, then I guess they don't want their research to benefit the community they serve. But I mean, a lot of the times, sometimes I find that that's an ableist's biggest argument. A lot of the time they go, well, how do you know that? Show me the research. Well, one, doesn't matter if I show you the research because you're still not going to believe what is being stated. Two, that research is hard to obtain. I actually find that an ableist tactic that is used quite often. With most of the research I do get, sometimes I do pay a little fee because I do want the full article. I want to read everything. I want to make sure that it's viable information. I just feel like I think there's quite a bit of research. I think that, for example, Ryerson University does have disability studies. They are doing wonderful work on research. There are resources for research, and I do think there needs to be done more to narrow down the real issues in different groups, because I mean, we're all unique. We can identify, we can be different races, we can be different economic statuses. So we really need to narrow those down. So I do look forward to Corinne to seeing the results from the research you guys are doing. I am so happy about that, to hear that. I just find that the research that has been done in the past about the abilities community, obviously, like most research, was very opinion-based, was used to judge the community, was used to stigmatize, make them feel unheard and disregarded. So that's always something I think, I myself am not a researcher, but is to be known, right? That is the research not only going to be valuable, but is it going to be actually used for change? And I know people like Corinne are those type of people who's going to take that research and make sure that it's going to be used for change. But there are many who do this research, keep it all to themselves, and then it's not creating the positive change it was originally supposed to create. So I hope that the recent survey that Shama was talking about, I'd really like to see those results, even though they are quite basic, because it's a starting point. At this, we have to start small and then kind of build up a little bit. Okay, we realize this is the thing. What's the other common denominator? So I hope it's not just, they do one series of research and then that's it. That doesn't solve a problem. Let's dig deeper. Let's make it transparent and let's make it super public.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. That was an excellent point. Well, two things, Corinne, I can't wait to read the report. And Christina, that was an excellent point that you brought on as well, in terms of making things more public and more accessible. So that was great. Thank you so much. I want to shift gears a little bit. I know that we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that we can get everything in before we allow our attendees to ask these questions. So I want to talk a little bit about the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan that was released a few weeks ago. For those of you who are not familiar with the report, it was co-authored by YWCA Canada, as well as the Institute for Gender and the Economy. Love to get your opinions, Jeanette, Kirin, and Wanda. What were your thoughts on this report after having read through it? Jeanette, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, you know what, truthfully, I thought the report was interesting. I struggled with it. So I'm going to be really frank and honest about it. I struggled with that report. I thought that the report was interesting, and I thought that the recommendations were a majority of them were very well thought out. I thought it was a good job. But quite frankly, I was disappointed in the report. And I don't mean this against anybody who was involved in it, but there were people who were not involved in it, and there was an exclusion of consultation with the disability community in that report. And disability as a word, when I read through it, I only found it, I think, twice in the body of the report, both times buried in a recommendation, and one time where it was a recommendation as a standalone. I felt like it was perpetuating a myth of vulnerability. It was only addressing disability from a place of vulnerability, and talking about having to have certain protections in place. And I'm not saying that the recommendation itself wasn't good, but it was a recommendation that was based on vulnerability instead of contribution. There was nothing in there about women who identify as having a disability being part of a solution. So, you know, so I struggled. I did struggle with the report a bit. You know, I know that there's a federal COVID-19 disability advisory group. I didn't see that they were included in that. And I mean, I read and read and read and read again, like I switched glasses to do it, to see, like, in the listing of all of the people who participated and contributed to that report. So to me, the collective voice of women who have a disability, or who identify as having a disability, was not represented. And for me, I think that the biggest concern there is that if we continue to exclude people who have a disability from planning and strategy creation, we are going to continue to exclude people from full participation as a full citizen. And I think that as women, we do need to stop this fragmentization. We need to stop it, and we need to unite as women to move our voices forward together. And so I was sad to see that there was exclusion happening in that report.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts, Jeanette. Wanda?
I was happy when it was released because we have it. And so we actually have a feminist recovery plan. That's a step forward. Disability was not mentioned. Jeanette raised excellent and thorough points. So I don't want to repeat what she said, because she did an excellent job. I'd like to focus more on what's next. So what I did was I reached out to the YWCA and I said, congratulations. I would love to talk about being involved in actioning the plan so that women with disabilities can be involved in operationalizing these aspects as we move forward in the recovery. Because the report's written, a lot of work needs to be done, and there's an opportunity, I understand, for a lot of people to be involved in that work that needs to be done. So I did receive a response from the YWCA, and I look forward to collaborating with them. I want to support what Jeanette said. In terms of women, in terms of intersectionality, disability has to be there, and it's not. Race, critically important. Ethnicity, critically important. Sexual orientation, critically important. Age, every dimension of identity, critically important. Disability is part of our identity, and it's just not always present front of mind. And I see a Q&A, and I don't want to dive in because I know you will you will lead us through later. However, in terms of an actionable step coming out of this, I'm ready. I'm ready. For those who have not read the report, I encourage them to do so because it is a feminist recovery plan and because there is a link to an article by the Disabled Women's Network.
Thanks, Wanda. Karen, I can see that you're like eager.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the link that like the research that it shows is not a research that's not a that's not a research that we've produced. We've produced a lot of research reports and also things that are fact sheets, so they're like more plain language or like easier for people who don't have PhDs or don't have the time to read 80 pages or more of text with, you know, footnotes and so much. So actually, the report I would suggest would be more in a footnote. Which is a research report we did on women with disability, like the state of women with disability in Canada. And the reason why we called it that, and it's slightly different in this one, is that something we noticed when we worked on gender-based violence and policies and, you know, policies, strategies, action plan, you know, whatever we want to call it, and provincial, federal, women with disabilities were always footnoted, you know? It's like you put people in a footnote, they're like, there are people who are more vulnerable. And again, we go in this vulnerability thing and we'll put a footnote of like, who are we talking about, right? And we'll mention new immigrants, we'll mention minority language, we'll mention people with disabilities, we'll mention, but then once you put someone in a footnote, that means that this person, those groups of people will never actually be part of the real action plan, right? When you're in a footnote, you're nothing else. And something that I think that I was very disappointed by this, and also not so much in some ways, because when I look at the people that were consulted, there are a lot of people that we work with, the reviewers, but those are people that, you know, don't always think about disability. And the reason why they don't always think about disability goes back to the lack of data. What data do we have about women with disability in Canada? Not enough. So it's really hard to take the lack of data and put it in a report like that that's very data focused and data driven. And so I'm not saying that and reach out to the YWC Canada as well, because they're partners. I work with different people on different things, and I reach out, and I actually have a meeting tomorrow with Anjum Sultana, who's the lead writer, to be like, hey, so what can we do? Right? It's also about the people that we're reviewing and their own internal biases, which we all do. But it's also about understanding, and when we think about intersectionality, and I think that's something that I always find a little tricky as someone who's both a woman but also Black and also queer, is that some aspect of my identities will always be put front and center by certain groups and other people, and certain aspect will never be. So parts around me around disability are never seen because they're invisible, because they're not important, will never be seen. And some groups will be like, we want to talk about race, right? And so they focus heavily around race, which I think is very important because there's a big race aspect in COVID, and the people were directly affected, whether it's, you know, Toronto, we know for sure, but also across the country. It's also the case in New York and the States. We know exactly what's happening in the States, and Canada is different, but not so different. And so I think I commend that, right? To do this report and take this, like, we know this. And that came out before the Toronto Public Health came out with like, this is what we currently know. However, often when people talk about intersectionality, it's easier to forget about disability. It's easier to forget about ableism. And I always find it interesting because when we go back to Audre Lorde, which often people remember as like a Black lesbian poet and author who wrote so much, she was also a woman with a disability. And she always talked about how she was never her full self. She could never be her full self, and to live a multi-layered life, right? At the same time, we remember her in LGBTQ movements, we remember her in Black circles, remember her as a woman. We rarely remember her as a person with a disability. From, you know, low vision to breast cancer to chronic pain, chronic health issues that actually are disability. That was also not necessarily the word that she personally used as well. So that's the other thing. But I'm saying all of this to say that I think that's something that's important to know, is that we need to, and I say we, but it's always like, that's something that Dawn does, right? It's this work of advocacy, of policy reform, this work of educating and doing the research and making sure that we have some research, and also seeing what research does exist. And sometimes creating our own research, right? Figure out like what exists around girls. There's so little about girls with disabilities in Canada. So we're gonna start doing a research with girls with disabilities, because we're like, if we don't do it, who's gonna do it? And it's also about making sure that the people we work with are also remembering and seeing things that maybe they're not seeing, because they know a lot of older people have died, but they don't realize a lot of those older people actually have people with disabilities. There are people who, a lot of people ask for medical assistance in dying because they were like, you know what? Since there's no imminent death criteria, why not? What's the point of living knowing I'm not going to get the services I need? And those are the things we need to ask ourselves when we think about a feminist recovery. And for me, something that's feminist is something that's deeply intersectional. And if it's not intersectional, then what's the point? And that's the thing that I'll be talking with Anjum tomorrow. But also, I think that's something we need to remember, and sometimes to just be like, you know, it's good, but it's not good enough. And maybe sometimes we'll sound harsh to people, but sometimes it's also good to just be like, we can do better. And we know it's harder to find the good studies. And sometimes we'll find the good studies that were done in, you know, in Norway or in the UK or in France or in Spain, but they're done in very similar contexts and actually reflect the realities that would be the same if we were to replicate the studies here. So we need to open our horizons and read things in many different languages to understand the realities of women with disabilities in Canada, until we get more scholars doing that work and also publishing that work and making it accessible for all of us, so we can learn and make sure that policy is actually based on the realities of women with disabilities.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Corinne. I know that we're right on this cusp, but there's one big important question that I'd like to ask before I access the Q&A right now. It's the biggest thing. Everyone has brought this up in conversation. It's a no-brainer about unemployment. Very clear how a lot of organizations have been incredibly opposed to working remote, and then COVID hit. And then almost everyone is like, yeah, let's do this. Let's work remotely, no problem. So that's one of the biggest things, right? And that's exactly the point that all of you had brought about how big of a challenge it was before, but now not so much, because it was their decision almost, right? It's so my question is, since the remote work and working from home has transitioning into a new norm, some form of another, how can hiring practices reflect that form of normalcy in terms of being more inclusive? Because that's part of the things, that there's such a huge amount of untapped talent that's being overlooked, especially when it comes to persons with disabilities or abilities, I like to say. So what are your thoughts on that? I'd like to get your feedback, Christina, Wanda, and Jeanette. Very quickly, if you wanted to sum it up in a minute, if you can, that would be awesome. So Wanda, if you want to kind of kickstart this.
Mm-hmm. It's going back to what I said. So in terms of an inclusive workplace culture, disability is there, so that when employers are talking about their priorities, when they're talking about diversity in the workplace, when they're talking about inclusion right across the board, diversity, as I say, and inclusion includes disability. So that is every diversity program, policy, practice, agenda, conversation. Disability is there with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, and every other dimension.
Thanks, Wanda. Jeanette?
Well, you set the bar high there, Wanda, on quick responses. So absolutely, that's a lot of the messaging that Odin does when we work with businesses. His, you know, you have diversity and inclusion plans. They're excellent plans. They're excellent programs. But where's disability in this mix? So we often work with businesses to help them improve and build on those diversity and inclusion plans and goals that they have. one of the things that we impart and believe quite strongly at Odin is that when you hire with intent, you have success. So you have to, that old saying, you have to name it to claim it. So that intentionality has to be part of the cultures, harkening back to what you were talking about, Wanda. So once you have the intent, the company can really look at their processes and their protocols for hiring, and they can start identifying all of those unintentional barriers that are causing them to miss out on a massive talent pool. The barriers can be related to so many things, so this is often very eye-opening for businesses, and we encourage them to do this exploration. It could be the online portals, or it can be more deeply rooted in a lack of awareness and confidence in hiring and managing a person who has a disability. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of lack of understanding. And I know somebody said, Wanda, I think it was you earlier, you said, you flourish when you're understood. And I think that as people managers, you flourish as a manager when you understand as well. So we have to make sure that both sides of that is being done. We have to increase that awareness. And when we flesh out that unconscious bias that exists, or at least try to flesh out the unconscious bias that exists, we can encourage companies then to really support their HR and their hiring managers so that they're able to successfully recruit talent from the disability talent pool, and then they'll start experiencing true inclusion and diversity.
Thanks, Jeanette. I think the point, which was an excellent point that you brought up, I know that we're over time, but specifically with organizations having diversity and inclusion as part of, or written in a mandate, also ensuring that there's some form of accountability as well when there's, especially if it's written in a mandate in terms of hiring practices, to measure how inclusive it is. So that was, thank you for bringing that up. Christina.
So obviously, I'm going to be echoing what everybody else has said. I think with hiring practices, the biggest thing is that creating a safe place. I know a lot of people in the abilities community do not even feel safe in an interview. They don't. And that alone can be a barrier, because you have to add the other barriers, right? Like food, transportation. So that means, you have to eat, then personal care before you have to go to an interview. All those things cost money and time. And, by the time most people get to an interview, they're physically and mentally exhausted. So they really need that understanding. They really need for someone to say, you know what, I notice you're really tired. I'm going to get you a glass of water and then we'll continue. Don't worry. You're safe. It's okay. It's almost this view that we have to start going, less critical and more human when it comes to hiring. I can tell you there's so many people with so many various disabilities where the biggest barrier is getting past the mindset and the negative speak that they're just so accustomed to. I mean, even myself, and many times, some of you might know, some of you might not, I go to networking events. I am very intertwined with the small business community. And even some people in the small business community don't realize where the ableism is. And they actually have witnessed it and they spoke up. Not for me, but they did it because they wanted they couldn't believe that someone would come up to me and ask me inappropriate questions about my own body that is private, that certain people have the privilege to have. And even those kind of things happen in interviews. Not asking me what my accommodations are, not asking me what I need to succeed in my employment, but almost asking me why should I hire you if you are not the status quo? Why should I? I mean, you you're very well educated, but how much time will it take for me to accommodate you? I'd really like that whole environment to really change. I would really like to hear in the future that there are other people with disabilities that when they go to an interview, they feel safe. They feel no shame of being judged or stigma. And what a lot of people are not understanding when they're hiring, this is still new. There are still people, this is a huge barrier, they're scared. And you may think, why would anybody be scared? But they're scared. And for years they were told, well, we can't accommodate you to work at home because it's too costly. So another thing that COVID has brought up is, okay, so you're willing to accommodate other people, but you're not willing to give accommodations so that you can tap into this wonderful pool of talent, well-educated people, but you choose to ignore them. Why? Is it the question that they need to ask themselves? Is it because they themselves are fearful of what they don't understand? Do they need to be educated? The questions that have to be asked are of the employer. I more and more think it's the job of those who are hiring to ask themselves those questions. Am I doing something that actually, is it the same question I would ask anybody else? Is it personal?
Thank you so much, Christina. And this has been a spectacular conversation. I feel like there's so many other things that we need to speak about. This has been amazing, just in terms, even for me personally, as a way to learn as well. This is a great knowledge piece. I have seen that there's been so many questions written, which is awesome. Unfortunately, just to be very honest, I don't think we'll be able to get to everyone. However, these questions I will be sending to the speakers to kind of share your thoughts and opinions as well. So I'm just going to kind of start in the beginning and just work my way down. So the first question is from Wendy. Who and what organizations are liaising with various disability support organizations to fully inform them of the overwhelming challenges that people with disabilities are facing, or have been facing, and continue to be facing?
Jeanette, does Jeanette want to start with that?
Would you like to, Jeanette?
Can you say the beginning part of that question again?
Yeah.
Sure. Who and what organizations are liaising with various disability support organizations to fully inform them of the overwhelming challenges that people with disabilities are facing, have been facing, and continue to face?
So for Odin, we operate sort of within the parameters of employment service provider organizations. Some of those organizations are also agencies that provide other types of supports for daily living, residential, life, education, so on and so forth. So really our view and the area that we operate in is in employment service providers who interact with the business community. So they do providing supports to employers and businesses. And what they do, so like I said before, Odin has about 150 organizations in our network. And these are organizations that are employment service provider agencies, and they're across the entire province of Ontario. And one of the big things that those agencies or organizations do is they educate and they inform and they support businesses when it comes to hiring and retaining, promoting, supporting a person who has a disability. Some of it might be task analysis work done ahead of time to support accommodations that are going to be potentially put in place. Some of it might be education, confidence, and awareness. We ourselves do a lot of that. Creating those safe spaces to have conversations so that people can ask the questions that they need to ask so that they understand, so that, to Christina's point, that fear factor starts to disappear. When we put everything out and talk, we start to understand each other. So a lot of the work that the organizations in the Odin Network do is spent educating, informing, and supporting the private sector, the business sector, to enable them to be a good employer and to ensure that people's rights are being protected. So we've seen big changes in the last, I guess, 5 or 6 years now. Partial legislation, the momentum kept going regardless of the legislation, to remove things like sheltered workshops, to stop unpaid work in competitive jobs, all sorts of different ways that people were potentially being taken advantage of or being put into situations where maybe they didn't feel empowered enough to refuse, or the continuous revolving door of training, because apparently you got to be fully trained before you do a job. I don't know. I don't think I was fully trained in the job that I'm doing now when I started. So, so we spend a lot of time in our organizations talk quite often with the businesses to do that education piece and translate that information and knowledge. So Wendy, I hope that somewhat answers your question from at least one aspect.
Thanks, Jeanette. So next one is from an anonymous attendee. What are your top words of wisdom to a child who is learning to learn and thrive with a disability? Christina, sure, that would be great, thanks. Oh, you just have to, yeah, perfect, thanks.
I don't know why it's lagging today. Well, I mean, we've all been children with disabilities, but something that really hit me hard as a kid was, and my mom's a hilarious woman. This is going to be funny, okay? I'm quoting my mother here, okay? I am quoting my mother. Christina, you're a lot of things, but you may be disabled, but you're not stupid. Don't let them treat you that way. And it sounds like for me, that got me through a lot of negative views of myself. That the best weapon in advocacy is education, not just in general, but education in growth in yourself. Understanding yourself, learning how and what works for you. And it is lifetime, and it is absolutely frustrating. It's frustrating. I remember numerous times when I was a child, I basically was told by every professional, like I guess they assume I didn't understand. But the way it seemed was every time the appointments were negative, every time my mother would be so upset to take me, my father. And it was this negative concept that was so ingrained at me that when I was 10 years old, I actually told my parents that it would probably be better for them, because I was tired of seeing them sad, that they listen to the professionals and give me away. So now imagine I was able to convey that. And a lot of the times I always look as a professional myself, and I look at those kids, and these beautiful children, some not able to speak, some assume that they don't understand, and it does not matter of their intellectual disability or developmental disabilities, I might add. They understand. They hear what professionals are saying. And I would say that as someone who's learning how to thrive and learn, that it's okay for your child to speak up for themselves too. And an important thing was also teaching them advocacy and their rights as a person. My mom was excellent. she taught me my rights as a person before I even got into school. And she wanted to make sure I remembered them, so she printed them out and laminated them. And she goes, if someone's treating you unfairly, whether it be a teacher, whether it be a doctor, I want you to look at this and ask yourself if this is wrong. And if the answer is yes, and you don't want to upset them, keep in mind, I was a pretty vocal child, so it was kind of my mom's way of being like, show them what rule they're breaking so that they can correct themselves. I remember as a child really hating school. I hated school not because, you know, there were some amazing teachers. I went to some amazing schools, but it wasn't just that. It was that I felt like I was always being compared to my peers, but I didn't think like my peers. And the only time, the different ways I figured out how to learn was always punished. I was always forced to be in that little box. And I can tell you, you being in the abilities community, you don't have to be in that box. You shouldn't have to go into a box to make an authority figure respect you. So, I mean, that's my viewpoint on it. I think, Janet, did you raise your hand? Okay, sorry. Sorry if I talk too much.
Jeanette, would you like to add anything?
I just wanted to point out that, you know, some of what Christina was sharing from her personal experience is something that we find sometimes reflected in a really great quote around the tyranny of low expectations and the dangers of that. And it's an article by Carol Glazer, came up out of the States. And in one of the things at the end of the quote that I'm familiar with, she says it's very hard to believe in when the world doesn't believe in you, it's very hard to believe in yourself. And that is the tyranny of the low expectations. And so I was so glad to hear Christina talking about the fact that there was a bar being raised for her and not being pushed into this tyranny of low expectations through her family. And often it's the family that needs to have to raise the expectations and to raise the expectations of everyone who's interacting with their child, so that we can push away from this tyranny of low expectations. And I just wanted to read a note from Ingrid Mushta, that we're trying to get her to share it with everybody that can read it in the chat. But she said, often it's not the person's disability has the issue, but rather the environment. Any child, regardless of a disability, can succeed if provided with the supports to make their environment or education, health, or participation accessible. And I just thought that was a really important point to flesh out.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Jeanette. So just looking, okay, 10 minutes. All right, we can do this. So the next question is from another anonymous attendee. What is one action, no matter how big or small, someone can walk away from today's panel and initiate today? Wanda?
Focusing on the positive, what Jeanette just said with that quote from Ingrid, often the dis in disability is society. The individual has the ability, society creates the barriers. So whatever anyone can do to help break that is a tremendous contribution. So ask questions. Going back to what I said earlier, if disability is not included in diversity and inclusion, ask. Or if a disparaging remark is made about someone with a disability, ask. Why are you saying that? What do you mean? Help me understand. The mistake that people often make is not knowing the power that they have. So anything you can do, you may think it's small, but for those of us with varying abilities, it's actually big. It's actually big. Anything you can do. So keep disability at the fore as much as possible. Intersectionality, remember disability, and ask questions. And if more people did this, just think of the incredible impact it could have.
Thanks, Wanda. I think, Christina, you brought up this earlier about being co-allies, which was an excellent point. So thanks. All right, so a question from Wendy. In the presenter's opinion, is it worth disclosing you have disabilities before or during an interview? Is it mandatory? I don't think so. Isn't it better to get the job and try to do it before disclosing anything about your disabilities? Thoughts?
Personally, for me, the reason why I think for me, I'm comfortable with disclosing. I don't disclose what my disabilities are, only how to be accommodated. I can give them that documentation later as to why. And then even then, they still don't have the right to know my specific disabilities.
I would like to jump in here as well.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We got Christine. Oh my.
It is me, yes.
Christine!
Yeah, yes. I've been listening this whole time and I had to actually switch computers. So thank you. I just want to say great work, everybody. And I just wanted to say disclosure is a very personal thing. And again, you don't have to give the details of your experience to Christina's point. It's about what accommodations do I need? And you are right to ask for those accommodations and you have a right to be part of the process. And I want to be clear in that saying that this is while employers are learning, there's an opportunity to kind of do some gentle education as well, but you're not meant to be the expert in all things. We're an expert in our own experiences. And I think that's really key is just because I live with a disability and have different experiences around different disabilities, doesn't mean I should be speaking on anybody else's behalf either. So I just want to be clear in terms of the, setting that groundwork. And it really is about co-allyship or allyship and informing yourself as we would want to learn about any other experience other than our own, reading, learning, talking to people, and not always having that one person who's like, here's my disability person, right? Because that's also exhausting for one individual as well. So there's great opportunities there in terms of that discussion around employment.
Thanks so much, Christine. I believe there's a specific question for you, Christine, if you don't mind just staying online here. And it's from Marlea Whitley. And the question is, let me just double check here. I would love to really hear about Christine's perspective on the use of the word disability and the power in owning the word. I was also wanting to hear her unique experience in her professional role.
Thanks very much, Marley, for asking that question. That's very nice of you. In terms of my experience around disability and use of the word, I believe language is power. I truly believe that talking about discourse is very important. And to what many of the panelists said earlier, I always start from a person-first perspective, use the language that individuals wish you to use. However, I truly am proud to be a disabled woman and to carry that with me. And I see it as shaping my world and my world experience. So if I can use that word with people and have them understand the power behind that and the reclaiming of what was seen as a very negative concept, then I have the ability to bring that forward as we talk about change, as we talk about the ability to have a new perspective and to bring in the intersectionalities of people's experiences as we move forward. Many people in the social justice field have worked for many, many years to destigmatize the word disability, and I want to honor that as well. And I see the power in it for myself. So that's kind of where I come from in terms of understanding that language piece. And I think that's you know, it's a good conversation to have with individuals about how they feel about the language they use around their experiences as well. When you have that opportunity to build that relationship, it's not a first off sort of question you ask somebody when you, hi, can you tell me what words you use to describe yourself kind of thing, but there's an opportunity there to deepen the conversation. In terms of my experience around my professional experience, I'm a diversity and inclusion specialist at the City of Ottawa, and we've done a lot of work around embedding a diverse and inclusive culture in our workplace. And it's an ongoing piece of work. It's never, I always say, I'm never going to work myself out of a job if we can, you know, because there's always evolving things that need to change and new experiences that need to be considered that weren't considered 5 years ago or 10 years ago, as an example. And it's looking at how those intersect with current experiences that we're aware of. So it's an opportunity to look at kind of some systemic issues within an organization. And as an organization that has a lot of influence and impact on other systems around it, we have an opportunity to take leadership in that discussion. And so I think that really is I'm honored to be part of that process. And even though as an individual, sometimes I struggle between my personal political approach to things and the structural organization, I think there's an opportunity there to push boundaries and to learn from experiences like today, to have those conversations. And it brings it into other discussions around how to work with groups like EARN. And you heard Shannon talk at the kickoff about what EARN is and what EARN does. I'm very proud to be on the leadership group and co-chair that leadership group so that we can have those conversations around employment and not just what's happening at the moment, but how can we move ahead and how do we engage more job seekers with disabilities in that process and change our organizations both internally, but also as a society, be leaders in that process. That's a very long answer for covering many things, but I hope that helped someone. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. No, that was absolutely amazing and awesome timing. By the way, I have to say thank you. So, wow, we're okay, right on the dot, 3:30. So I want to make this very important, very clear, is that anyone who did present their questions, I'm not going to dismiss them, just so that you're aware. I will be sharing them with the speakers to get their opinions. So stay tuned on that. And so you will get a response as well. So just so that we're very clear, not dismissing them. We just unfortunately don't have time to get to everyone as well. So with that in mind, one, thank you to everyone who joined the conversation this afternoon. Thank you so much, speakers. I'd like to thank Courtney and Leslie, who are our interpreters for this afternoon, Michelle for captioning, Zaima, who was the events and jobs coordinator at EARN, providing me additional support, Shannon Bruce for aiding the sponsorship of this event, and of course EARN as well for making this conversation happen. So thank you all so much. I was actually going to say wonderful weekend, but I realized that tomorrow is Friday. But thank you so much for saying yes to this very important conversation. And certainly there are many other conversations to be had in the realm of disability. So thank you so much for making this happen, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.